There was no single moment when Genghis Khan magically unlocked the secrets of warfare. No divine revelation, no hidden scroll of battle wisdom, just 4 decades of relentless trial, error, and an ungodly amount of discipline. He was a human sponge, soaking up every trick his enemies threw at him, then wringing them out onto the battlefield even better. The Mongols perfected hit-and-run raids, feigned retreats, and ambushes so precise they felt like scripted cutscenes, until the Mongols found themselves on the other end of that equation. Everything Genghis Khan spent 40 years mastering, the Vietnamese copied in a day and then used it against his descendants with interest. What happens when an empire built on deception, adaptability, and psychological warfare runs into an enemy who study their playbook cover to cover? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they did it. But before we break it all down, what's your guess? How do you think Vietnam managed to outsmart the Mongols? Drop your thoughts and let's see if you can crack the code before we lay it all out. Winning a war without breaking a sweat, is there anything more satisfying? Instead of all that exhausting battlefield nonsense, why not let the enemy do the hard work for you? Marching for hundreds of miles, exhausted, sunburnt, and questioning their life choices, while you sit back, relax, and enjoy a nice meal. It's a strategy as old as time, and few did it better than Tran Quang Kai. The Mongols, battle-hardened, fearless, and absolutely terrifying on horseback, came in expecting an easy win. After all, they had steamrolled half of Eurasia by this point. But what they didn't expect was a general who turned annoying the enemy to death into an art form. Instead of meeting them head-on in a glorious but doomed clash, Tran Quang Kai perfected the waiting game. When the Mongols finally arrived, panting, starving, and seriously reconsidering their life choices, he was well-rested, well-fed, and ready to ruin their day. But you can't just sit around forever. No, you have to make the enemy's life actively miserable, in just the right doses. Cut off their supply lines so they run out of food at the worst possible moment. Lead them on wild goose chases that drain their energy. Let them spend sleepless nights jumping at shadows while your troops are snoozing soundly. And that's exactly what Tran Kai did, because taking on the Mongols in a direct fight, that would have been like boxing a grizzly bear with pool noodles. Instead, he played the long game, hit-and-run ambushes, strategic retreats, and an endless series of psychological torment that left the Mongols stuck in an absolute logistical nightmare. Their supply lines stretched thin, their horses weakened in the humid terrain, and their troops, accustomed to lightning-fast victories, found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition. They kept chasing shadows, missing their targets, and getting increasingly hangry. After storming through the northeastern coast in a grand, dramatic pursuit, the Mongol navy found themselves grasping at thin air again. They were hunting for the Tran King across the vast ocean, but he was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, their supplies running on fumes, the 2 Mongol commanders, Sogetu and Omar, were in a logistical nightmare. Their armies were starving, their men were exhausted, and their best strategy at this point was just hoping for a miracle. Their supply lines were so dry, you'd think they were trying to invade the desert instead of a land famous for its rice paddies. Sogetu, poor guy, was dragging his weary troops northward to regroup, only to get hit. "Sorry, we're full." Togon took one look at his dwindling food stock and said, "You're on your own." Exhausted from years of fighting his way from Champa to Dai Viet, enduring battles, disease, and the occasional existential crisis, Sogetu hoped for a nice warm welcome from his fellow commander, and instead, your commander tells you to scavenge for your own meals. And when an army is hungry and desperate, things get ugly. So, Sogetu let his men loose in a ruthless rampage of looting and pillaging. The army went full barbarian mode, thinking they could steal their way out of starvation. But it didn't work. No matter how much they plundered, it was never enough to feed the entire force. The local villagers had already packed up, fled into the forests, and hidden their food, with the kind of secrecy usually reserved for state secrets. Anything they couldn't carry, they burned. Let's talk about Togon. He'd already refused to let his buddy Sogetu join him because, well, his supply situation was so bad that adding more mouths to feed would have been like inviting extra guests to a dinner party when you've only got half a loaf of bread left. The supply lines trickled in. Dai Viet's guerrilla warriors were raiding, burning, and generally making sure nothing useful ever reached the front lines. Every time the Mongols tried to set up a supply depot, it got hit. Every time they tried to move food, it mysteriously disappeared. Every road they relied on became a war zone. And then came the weather. Ah, yes. The wonderful, sticky, soul-draining humidity of Southeast Asia. The Mongols were built for the cold, dry expanses of the steppe, not for a climate that made their armor feel like a personal sauna. While sudden monsoon floods turned their camps into swamps, weapons rusted, food rotted, and disease spread like gossip in a royal court. Malaria? Dysentery? Take your pick. The invasion had dragged on for 3 months. And now, as spring turned into the humid hellscape of early summer, Mongol troops were wilting like unwatered houseplants. They were hungry, exhausted, and struggling with the sheer misery of it all. So there the Mongols were, an army too tired to fight, too hungry to function, and too deep in enemy territory to retreat. After seizing Thang Long, Li Hung had a bold idea. Maybe we should settle in, stockpile food, and build some fortifications so we don't get kicked out the moment the Tran dynasty regroups. A reasonable plan, right? Well, not according to the rest of the Mongol leadership. Togun shut that idea down immediately. If they split up too much, the Dai Viet forces would pick them off one by one, which, to be fair, was a valid concern. And he had a point. The Mongols were running out of options. They didn't have the manpower or supplies to control every region, like they had earlier in the campaign, but they also couldn't just sit in one place and wait to starve. So, in a move that was half strategic planning and half desperate improvisation, Togun decided to spread his army out along the Red River, creating a chain of garrisons. These bases, scattered from Thang Long, Hanoi now, to places like Changdang, Hamtu, and Tayet, would allow the Mongols to keep raiding for food while still supporting each other in case of a counterattack. And where was Togun during all this? Kicking back in Thang Long, trying to hold everything together while his commanders argued. His supply line collapsed, and his soldiers realized that conquering Dai Viet was a lot harder than they had been led to believe. In doing so, he left a gaping hole in the south. Thang Hoa and a bunch of other key regions were suddenly Mongol-free. And guess who noticed? Tran Quang Kai saw the empty lands. He led his entire army straight to Thang Hoa, like a guy snagging the best seat in an empty movie theater. Once there, the Tran Kai and the army finally got the break they desperately needed, a much-earned pit stop to rest, regroup, and restock supplies after their last not-so-glorious counterattack. Yeah, even masters of the long game can fumble. Earlier, the Tring had launched an attack, and let's just say it didn't exactly go as planned. For the full drama, check the previous episode. The Mongols hit back hard, and the Tran forces found themselves needing a serious timeout. But this wasn't just a retreat, it was a reset. They weren't just playing hide-and-seek anymore. Tran Quang Kai made sure his forces were positioned just right, near the coast, guarding key strongholds. If the Mongols tried to sneak attack, they'd be walking straight into a very unpleasant surprise. By the time the Mongols finally pieced together where the Tran army had vanished to, their scouts probably sprinted back to report his findings to their leader. Togun immediately ordered Omar to set sail with a fleet of 60 warships and 1,300 troops to meet up with Sogetu's forces in Truong Yen and smash into Thang Hoa to finish off the Tran army once and for all. These men marched for days, surviving on whatever scraps they could find. The reinforcements coming from Truong Yen were moving slower than a snail stuck in a tar pit. And then, bam, they ran straight into Tran Quang Kai. At this point, Sugetu's troops and Trankankai's men were so familiar with each other, it was basically a monthly reunion. Except, instead of shaking hands, they were swinging swords. But this time, oh, this time was different. Gone were the days of Trankankai and his men running for their lives, barely able to fight off starving Mongol troops. Now, he had the upper hand. His forces were well positioned, well rested, and absolutely ready. What followed was an absolute beatdown. Throughout April 1285, Sugetu and Omar threw everything they had at Trankankai, but time and time again, they came up empty. They had been in Thanghua for way too long, fighting battle after battle. The Tran army wasn't even trying to chase down the Mongols. They just sat there, blocking every path forward, like a brick wall with an attitude. To make matters worse, Thanghua was not the ideal place to be stuck for an invading army. The land was sparse, food was non-existent, and the supply lines were a distant memory. So Sugetu's troops were running so low on food that even their emergency snacks had emergency snacks. Their grand Mongol war horses, legendary symbols of power, were probably eyeing each other nervously, wondering who was going to be dinner first. Realizing that the dream of conquering Thanghua was officially dead, Sugetu and Omar made the executive decision to cut their losses and head north, to Tate. Why? Because the Red River Delta was their best bet at, well, not starving to death. There, they could at least raid villages for food. Food, assuming there was anything left to take, but the people of Dai Viet weren't about to let that happen. They saw what was coming a mile away and pulled out the legendary scorched earth tactic. Essentially, the Mongols arrived expecting a buffet and found an empty fridge with a single, sad, moldy rice grain inside. To make matters worse, the villagers stayed behind, and they fought back. Every time the Mongols tried to raid for supplies, they were met with pitchfork-wielding farmers, hidden traps, and the occasional well-aimed rock to the face. Thanks to Trankankai's airtight defense, the Tran court and the entire army were as safe as a cat lounging in the sun, unlike the Mongols, who were relying on whatever scraps they could loot. They had stockpiled food before the war even started, and the economy had been booming in during peacetime. Farmers, merchants, and everyday folks chipped in to keep the army fed and ready. See, they weren't naive. They knew their prime real estate on the world map meant that someone, sooner or later, would come knocking with an army. According to Tran Han Tong, there were 100,000 troops just hanging out with him alone. Now, was that number exaggerated to boost morale? Probably, but even if we cut that in half, Dai Viet still had plenty of soldiers. With reinforcements from the Red River Delta joining them, they were sitting at around 200,000 troops, not as many as the Mongols, but at this point, quality mattered more than quantity. But this war wasn't just about numbers. This was about strategy, about knowing exactly what not to do when facing the Mongols. Because if history has taught us one undeniable fact, it's this: underestimating the Mongols is a first-class ticket to disaster. You had two choices: think outside the box or become a footnote in Genghis Khan's conquer list. Unfortunately, the empires of Central and East Asia, Khwarezm, Western Xia, the Jin and the Song, mostly chose the second option. They throw everything at the Mongols in one gigantic battle. Until you remember that Mongol cavalry moved like a medieval fast and furious crew, while their enemies were still figuring out traffic laws. Once these grand armies got outmaneuvered and crushed, they had no plan B. So, what did they do next? Hide behind fortress walls. And here's where things went from bad to worse. Because if there was one thing the Mongols were really good at, aside from everything, it was siege warfare. Surround the city, wait for reinforcements, then smash them, and turn supposedly impenetrable fortresses into glorified cages. The defenders couldn't run, couldn't resupply, and eventually had to choose between surrendering or starving. Neither worked out well for them. So, why the Mongol flight so hard to take Dai Viet? Were the Mongols getting weaker? Not exactly. But the army they faced wasn't the same old nomad horde, fighting purely for survival. It wasn't even the same terrifying, desperate warriors from Genghis Khan's glory days. The original Mongols fought like their entire survival depended on it, because it did. Gone were the days of the scrappy steppe warriors. The harsh environment had morphed them into one career path: win or die. They evolved into a hybrid crew, a blend of Mongol, Korean, Chinese, and other flavors, living for the thrill, the glory, and yes, the fame. In a way, they weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting because, well, that was their job. These weren't desperate nomads fighting for survival. They were employees in an empire too big to fail. Conquest had become a family business, with Genghis Khan's descendants dividing up the world like it was an inheritance. Because when one side is fighting to exist and the other is fighting for a paycheck, you don't have to guess which side is going to want it more. But what made them so powerful beyond just the motivation of their ancestors? Remember, Genghis Khan had a habit of picking up new tactics from every land he conquered, and that adaptability didn't disappear with him. It was still alive and well among the Mongol commanders of this invasion, Sogetu and Togon. Their army was a terrifyingly efficient mix of warriors who could handle nearly any battlefield. The Mongols brought their unstoppable cavalry. The former Jin soldiers knew how to navigate the rugged southern terrain, and the ex-Song dynasty troops were masters of river warfare. Put them together and you had a well-balanced nightmare. Nobody in their right mind would call the Yuan army weak. If anything, they were constantly on the move, barely getting a break, and yet still terrifyingly effective. Desperate, absolutely, but weak, not a chance. Take Sogetu and his men, for example. These poor guys basically ran the worst marathon in history, sprinting up and down Dai Viet, getting sent all the way to Champa, then immediately being recalled north again. When they ran out of supply, they didn't wait for reinforcements. They became their own reinforcements. When Sogetu was in Champa and the local resistance wasn't putting much pressure on him, he didn't retreat or wait for supply lines to catch up. Instead, he had his men set up farms. That's right, these warriors doubled as farmers, growing their own food to keep the war machine running. So, how did Vietnam outsmart the Mongols? One major advantage for Dai Viet was their deep, long-standing knowledge of the Mongols. Their generals had read all the books, taken all the notes, running drills, and probably had stress testing every possible scenario. They respected the Mongols, feared them, and prepared so meticulously that they even overdid it, just in case. Then they flipped the script. Everything Genghis Khan had spent 40 years perfecting, hit-and-run attacks, feigned retreats, ambush warfare, Dai Viet had copied, adapted, and weaponized against his descendants. The Mongols thrived in wide-open spaces, like the Eurasian steppe or the deserts of Central Asia. There they could ride in, shoot, retreat, and repeat. But Dai Viet was a completely different battlefield. Dense jungles, mountains, and swampy terrain that turned Mongol cavalry into sitting ducks. You can't do hit and run if there's nowhere to run, except into a bamboo thicket or a rice paddy. When the Mongols used hit-and-run tactics, they usually had somewhere safe to retreat to, a stronghold, friendly territory, or at least an open plain to escape in. In Dai Viet, they had nowhere to go. The deeper they advanced, the more they got bogged down in unfamiliar, hostile terrain. Every retreat led them into another trap, ambush, or starvation zone. Normally, when the Mongols struck, they had somewhere safe to retreat to, a stronghold, friendly territory, or at the very least, an open field where they could vanish like ghosts on horseback. But in Dai Viet, the deeper they advanced, the worse it got. Every step forward led them further into a hostile, unfamiliar landscape, where every retreat turned into another ambush, every river crossing became a death trap, and every failed supply run brought them closer to starvation. If the Mongols managed to hold onto the Red River Delta for too long, they might actually recover. The last sign that the Mongols were at their weakest was their failed attempt to break through Thang Hoa. If Dai Viet didn't keep the pressure on, the Mongols might settle in and fortify their positions. Worse still, if they managed to crush local resistance and secure the area, Dai Viet would be in serious trouble because the land south of Thang Hoa just didn't have the same resources. You saw how much Sogatu's forces suffered earlier, right? If Dai Viet wanted a perfect moment to strike, this was it. And boy, did the Tran court know it. Emperor Tran Nan Tong gathered his advisors and declared, plain and simple, these guys have been marching for years, dragging their supplies across half of Asia. They're tired, they're weak, and we were rested, fed, and ready to fight. First we break their spirit, then we break their army. It was now or never. The Mongols were weakening, and if Dai Viet didn't seize this chance, the opportunity would be lost. The time for the final counterattack had arrived. By late May 1285, Dai Viet was done playing defense. They needed to crush them in a few big, decisive battles. The Tran forces launched a massive counterattack, splitting into two powerful strike groups. As for the exact number of soldiers involved, history decided to keep that little detail a secret. Maybe it was a tactical move. Let's keep the enemy, and future historians, guessing. Leading the Eastern Front was none other than Tran Quang Kai. He took his fleet straight out to sea. Yes, you heard that right. Only to loop back through the waterways, slicing into enemy positions. His main goal was reclaiming the heartlands of the Tran dynasty, Thien Truong and Truong Yen. These areas weren't just strategic gold mines. They were the home turf of the ruling family. Once Dai Viet secured these strongholds, they had two options. Go full throttle northward along the rivers, cut off the Mongols from the east, and slam the door shut on their escape route. Or if things get dicey, they could fall back and dig in at Thien Truong and Truong Yen, turning the place into a fortress of resistance. This was a huge risk, though, because if you've been paying attention, you'd know one thing: the Mongols were master siege warfare. If Dai Viet wasn't careful, their strongholds could turn into death traps. While Tran Quang Kai was out there pulling off his now you see me, now you don't naval maneuvers, the Western strike force was gearing up for its own grand entrance. This force, commanded by Tran Quang Kai, Emperor Tran Nan Tong, and the retired but still in charge former King Tran Tai Tong, along with all the generals, wasn't about to let the Eastern Front have all the fun. Their mission was to smash through the Mongol strongholds along the Red River, march straight for Thang Long, and, if all went according to plan, cut off communication between Sogetu and Togon. And just like that, the pieces were in motion. Two strike forces, one mission: crush the Yuans and take back Dai Viet. With Tran Quang Kai out there playing naval chess, zigzagging through the waterways, and Tran Quang Kai leading the charge up the Red River, the counterattack was in full swing. And the Yuan forces, they had dug in, fortified their positions, and braced for impact. But here's the million-dollar question. Did the Tran dynasty pull off the greatest comeback in medieval warfare? Or was this just another episode of Catch Me If You Can, Dai Viet edition? Were the Mongols finally out of patience? Or was it only a matter of time before they came storming back like a landlord collecting overdue rent? Well, that's a story for another time. But if you've made it this far, congratulations. You didn't just watch a history video. You lived through the suspense, the tactics, and the drama of an empire fighting for survival. So, did you guess the outcome? Did history play out the way you expected? If you want more epic battles, more cunning strategies, and more history told with a little extra flair, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going, and make sure you never miss another deep dive into the past. Thanks for watching. See you.